Hey there, do you like video games? Do you like Christopher Nolan movies? Do you like the 80s? How about sci-fi? Which sci-fi? All the sci-fi. All at once, rolled up into an overstuffed Chipotle burrito and told out of order. And also, it's anime as fuck. Sentinels Aegis Rim is a terrible name for a very good video game. Airdropped by Atlas into the chaotic and generally disastrous fall 2020 release schedule, it's the latest and probably most ambitious of indie developer Vanillaware's passion projects and took them out of their fantasy comfort zone with a sci-fi story. Strike that, the sci-fi story, because if it's science and it's fiction, it's crammed somewhere into this bursting corset of a story. There's mechas and kaiju, time travel, time loops, simulations, nanomachines, terraforming, space colonies, androids, AI, magic, talking cats. It's complicated, and it's mostly up to you what order you deal with it in. So let's back up a little bit and start with the structure Vanillaware worked so hard to piece together. Compartmentalization is the basis of the 13 Sentinels experience. There are 3 game modes: Destruction, which is a real-time strategy mechs versus kaiju combat sim; Analysis, which is the designated evolving lore tracker that will make more sense when I tell you about Remembrance, which is the pseudo-visual novel story that, and breathe in with me, features 13 different playable protagonists whose individual stories overlap, are told out of chronological order, operate on branching paths that all canonically happen just at completely different times, and conflate dreams, premonitions, memories, and straight-up hallucinations. Oh, also, the combat portions have their own story that takes place at the end of the overall plot, and you have to complete portions of each gameplay feature to unlock more of the others. Are you confused? Don't worry, that's where game design comes in. When it comes to the experience, you have the power, but it's nothing overboard. The plot is inherently convoluted, but at no point does it ever really become too much. Sections are locked off at very carefully chosen points, which keeps the information drip in check no matter what angles you attack the narrative from. Vanillaware composes a kind of interactivity built on your impulse. The way the characters' perspectives intertwine sort of leads you in the direction they want you to go. Here's a good example. When I played, I made the executive decision to save Renya Goto for last, to not touch him at all until I was almost done, because he gives the impression of a character who knows more than the rest, like a connective tissue of all the pilot's stories. As it turns out, he is, and most of his story is actually locked off anyway until you're almost done with the rest. That doesn't mean the interactivity is superficial, it means it's well thought out. From the way the battle segments feed their character and story developments back into the narrative segments, to the helpful feature where you can check the lore tracker and literally replay other parts of the plot in the middle of remembrance scenes, Vanillaware's prime directive is to help you participate in their story in the most impacting way possible. Big reveals are always a bit of a gamble, and one I tend not to trust, but the secret ingredient to 13 Sentinels is that there are no big reveals. The majority of its mysteries can be unraveled in almost any order, and it's so pragmatically built that the active player is always on the cusp of understanding without ever really getting sick of being teased. But what is the story, you ask, several minutes into my ramblings? Well, that's just a landmine of a question, so here's a very vague synopsis. 13 Sentinels follows 13 kids who pilot Sentinels, these big mechs that are kind of a cross between Evas and Gundams. The plot kicks off with a kaiju attack in 1985, so not Shinji here decides he mustn't run away, and the final battle for Earth starts up. The subsequent 29.5 hours or so of gameplay unravel the events leading up to this last stand, as kaiju invade and destroy the same city in different time periods, and the pilots cross paths while being tracked by a spooky shadow organization. It's all very 80s, very self-aware, very meta, and very, very convoluted, and because mecha is an inherently horny genre, of course, all of these teens are also madly in love with each other. The good news is, the writing is absolutely vacuum tight, and usually charming enough to carry the weight of the melodrama and anime of it all. The characters are really standout and likable. Personally, I adored about 8 of them, and really only hated 1, and their relationships read as surprisingly genuine. That's because, unlike most visual novels, 13 Sentinels is also fully voiced. Now, to those of you who know a lot about voice acting, this may sound worrying. As we all know, there are only 18 professional English-speaking voice actors in the world. Luckily, Atlas spared no expense in scraping up at least 13 of them. The voice acting is consistently great, and it adds a lot of legitimacy to the absolutely bananas stuff that goes down pretty much the whole time you'll be following these kids in their misadventures. And that legitimacy comes in handy, because if there's one true weakness to 13 Sentinels, it's a fair bit of stiffness. The combat portions are simplistic RTS battle sims, and while they're definitely entertaining enough, the strategy isn't quite deep enough to stand on its own, and the story woven into it isn't quite as seamless as it needs to be to make you forget you're basically playing a different kind of point and click. The visuals are very impressive. As flat as the environments are, they're gorgeous to look at, and when the voice lines aren't written onto the screen, there are some genuinely awe-inspiring shots. But the UI struggles to integrate well. The thought bubble system and the occasionally confusing in a bad way branching paths, they tend to derail the flow of a story that demands a lot of focus and risk ruining your sense of immersion. Speaking of focus, it's worth mentioning the horny vibes. Mecha is a horny genre, generally speaking. Is it Ava's fault? I don't know. But 13 Sentinels is no exception to that rule. The kids are always naked inside the mechs, which is a common thing with some symbolic value, but it's very noticeable thanks to the Metal Gear-style dialogue portraits. They all have these, human QR tags that call in the Sentinels, and some of them are in unnecessary places, but still, that's forgivable. What is not is... my god. It's just absolutely immersion-breaking. Who thought this was a good idea? Why does she have a cat suit? Now, there's also been division over this character from the 40s and his reaction to his gay thoughts. I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, so I'll just say it kind of makes sense within the world, but the bit goes on way too long. Right, so that's 3.5 problems, depending on your sensibilities. 2.5 if you're an anime fan. For a copious and ambitious sci-fi buffet, that's a jaw-droppingly low margin of error. 13 Sentinels doesn't play coy with its absolute behemoth of a story, constantly pumping out information that fills in the cracks of an incomplete picture. It's a surprisingly rewarding way to experience such a convoluted narrative, and more than enough reason to pay attention for every last minute of it. At a time when Atlas is more popular than ever, and people are actually sitting down for 30-plus hour playable movies, I would have expected this game to make a little more of a splash. Is it because it's so anime? Probably, but at one point, so was Persona. I really hope people start to make that connection, because Vanillaware trusted Atlas to sell something truly special. And all things considered, 13 Sentinels might just be the best movie I've ever played.
Is it from the nanomachines?